Feldwebel Otto Paul was the navigator on a Heinkel 111 that made a forced landing on the beach at Bridport in Dorset on November the 6th, 1940. 3 other crew members scrambled to safety, but Otto's body was washed up on the beach later that day. His remains were brought here to Cannock after it opened in 1967. A casualty of the Battle of the Beam. Ype Churchyard on the Downs above the beach at Bridport, the first resting place of the Heinkel navigator Otto Paul in 1940. A long-lasting brick structure in a field in Charley, which is now known to the members of the Charley Heritage Group as being built in World War II. Here they are, looking at the quality of the brickwork and quite bowled over by all that has been discovered about its purpose and use in the war.
I'd like to know is the connection between this trailer and the grave that we saw at Cannock Chase yesterday.
Otto Paul's grave?
Yes.
Well, Otto Paul's Heinkel came down because of RAF 80 Wing's countermeasures during World War II. Just what was going on here.
Oh, I'd like to know more about that.
Had it originally got a roof on then, Wolf? No roof on it?
No roof.
It was just the impact side blast then, was it, last war?
That's all.
Just painted it with it.
Just pretending, yes.
Got to give the impression.
We now know that these blast walls were built to shelter a radio trailer. Inside the trailer were 2 transmitters, officially known as TU4s, Transmitter Unit Type 4.
Yes, the RAF used a special type of code speak for these transmitters. They called them Benjamins, so the Jerrys would not know what they really were.
This trailer, we have discovered that there were 4 other sheds spread across this field in World War II. Inside 3 of them were 2 other types of radio transmitters, aspirins and bromides in RAF code speak.
So this was a top secret RAF unit in World War II, and nobody locally had any idea what it was for. We've embarked on a journey of discovery, and we will tell you all about what we have found.
Imagine it is 1938. Hitler has been in power in Germany for 5 years. Rearmament has long been a national priority. A reborn Luftwaffe was creating a huge new bomber force. Air crews were being intensively trained on Junkers 88s, Dornier 17s and these Heinkel 111s. One aspect of flying at that time was the mundane need of these bomber pilots to find their runway at the end of a sortie, particularly in bad weather. They needed some sort of device in the cockpit that would help them to fly in line with the runway. These German scientists came up with the answer, working with a company founded in 1880 by Karl Lorenz. Transmitters were sited at the landing end of the airfield runway. One beam was sent away from the airfield, just left of the line of approach. The pilot would hear this steady pulse of dots in his headphones if he was off the approach line to the left. If the pilot was off to the right, he would hear a stream of dashes, leading him to steer slightly left to come back to the approach line. The 2 beams actually had a slight overlap in the middle, which meant the dot and dash sounds would merge into this continuous echo signal. If the pilot could keep his aircraft on this central track, he would be reassured by this constant pulse in his headset. These 2 overlapping beams form the Lorenz system built into every bomber in the Luftwaffe armada. But Dr. Plendl knew that the primary purpose of these bombers was to fly long distances from home over enemy territory and set their bombs down on selected targets. How to help the pilots find their targets was his mission. Very cleverly, Dr. Plendl turned the Lorenz beam round the other way, stretching it out from a transmitter in Germany to a target in Britain. Knickerbein means crooked leg, which was the other beam coming in this diagram from Bredstedt in northern Germany. When the pilot picked up the Bredstedt signal, he knew it was time to drop his bombs. Plendl's system needed a massive aerial array to power out the beams. From the location in Germany, the aerial had to be 100 metres wide and 30 metres high. To enable alignment on any target, it was mounted on a central pivot with wheels on circular tracks at the edge. Here is what the Cleve aerial looked like, built on a hill just outside the German border town. The circular track can be seen at the bottom of the image. It was identical to the aerial erected at Bredstedt. The circular track of the Cleve aerial picked up in 1940 by a Spitfire on reconnaissance. The same aerial casting shadows in the snow in January 1945. And here's a modern image of the Cleve site captured by Google Earth. Still a part-time military training park, with the central circle marking out the base of that big aerial. But it retains some evidence of its past as the base for that huge Knickerbein aerial. Concrete emerges from the scrub in many places. And a German family enjoyed a piece of the area on a ramble in 2012. And here's the view westwards, towards England, the track of those first beams. In 1940 the Luftwaffe would have been polishing up its target lists. No doubt the Merlin Aero engine factory in Derby would have been very high up on those lists.
The Air Ministry called in this man, Dr. R.V. Jones, a physics don and an expert in infrared radiation. Dr. Jones was given a desk in Whitehall and a commanding brief to bring science to bear on all things air defence. Jones, partly intuitively, latched onto the possibility that enemy bombers might be capable of using some sort of target-seeking system based on transmissions within the radio spectrum. But how did we in Britain know about these beams? Britain's government had long known it would have to harness the scientific brains of the nation to meet the coming military threat. And so it assembled the famous list of 5,000 scientists, mathematicians and engineers who would be willing to accept a call. We are familiar with the brain power that was brought into Bletchley Park and the large number of Y stations created to gather in Enigma encrypted German radio messages for its code breakers to work on.
Clues were beginning to come across Dr. Jones' desk that backed up his hunches. A scrap of paper from a crashed Luftwaffe bomber featured Knickerbein, a radio beacon, and the 31.5 megacycle frequency. Then an Enigma decode linking Knickerbein with the German town Clever and the coordinates of the Nottinghamshire town of Retford. So, Dr. Jones reasoned, a radio beam was coming out of Clever and Retford was being used as a practice destination. Captured German aircrew were always handled with kid gloves and initially detained in comfortable surroundings. As well as gentle but persistent interrogation, their later private conversations were listened to and recorded. Dr. Jones was particularly interested in the eavesdrop material about Excarat and related receiving apparatus in the cockpit. A second scrap of paper from a bomber crash in France identified the German towns of Clever and Bredstedt as the beam sources, together with their position and the frequency used. Dr. Jones was now clear in his mind. German bombers could fly down a beam laid towards a target, identified when a second beam crossed over at the target. Knickerbein, the crooked leg. But what puzzled him was the original crashed Heinkel 111 did not appear to have any sort of special receiver that might be part of the beam system. The boffins at Farnborough hit upon the answer. A new study of the standard Lorenz blind landing kit from the crashed bomber showed it had a sensitivity far greater than needed for simple blind landing use. Dr. Jones sensed that he had cracked it. The Knickerbein system could therefore work with the blind landing receivers fitted to every bomber. A very frightening prospect. So on the 18th of June 1940, Jones persuaded the Royal Air Force to put up a search plane to find the beams. No luck. And not on the 20th of June either. The final flight took place on the 21st of June, personally authorised by Churchill. For this flight, due to take off from Whiten Airfield near Huntington, Dr. Jones had to make a fateful decision. On which track should he set the aircraft's direction of flight? He reasoned that the most important target in the mind of the enemy would be the Rolls-Royce engine factories at Derby, where the famous Merlin engine was being built. That would mean that any beams from Cleaver and Bredstead would come across Lincolnshire, so Dr. Jones ordered the Anson flight to head north from Whiten. Dr. Jones' hypothesis was totally vindicated. The next day at a special meeting, the flight crew appeared and gave their report.
Gentlemen, good morning. We're ready to hear about last night's Anson flight. Please welcome Flight Lieutenant Hal Bufton and his wireless operator, Corporal Mackey. Thank you for making the journey. I guess you haven't had much sleep and we're ready to hear your report.
We report 1. That there is a narrow beam approximately 400 to 500 yards wide passing through a position 1 mile south of Spalding, having dots to the south and dashes to the north on a bearing of 104 degrees. 2. That the carrier frequency of the transmissions on the night of 21st 22nd of June was 31.5 megacycles per second, modulated at 1150 cycles and similar to Lorenz characteristics. 3. That there is a second beam having similar characteristics but with dots to the north and dashes to the south, synchronized with the southern beam, apparently passing through a point near Beeston on a bearing lying between 60 degrees plus and less than 104 degrees. Thank you, gentlemen.
After the euphoria of discovering the Knickerbein beams, the assembled company went very quiet. The awful reality began to sink in. Every enemy bomber with its Lorenz receiver could ride those beams. No city or armament factory would be immune to accurate targeting by the Luftwaffe. This could easily happen. A very urgent response was needed, and it came in the immediate creation of a new unit, RAF 80 Wing Signals. It was placed under the charge of another boffin turned airman, Wing Commander Addison. Addison coined the wing motto, "Confusion to our enemies," which was indeed the tactic it used, rather than outright jamming. Addison requisitioned a big house at Radlett in Hertfordshire as the headquarters, where he installed a formidable team. They developed a control room which exercised tight control over a rapidly growing countermeasure enterprise. At great speed, a chain of simple watcher stations were opened, mostly on the coastal fringes, to listen out for the enemy beams and pinpoint their frequencies. Soon, up to 44 outstations were set up in ad hoc fashion across the country, all equipped with a variety of countermeasure transmitters. Gradually, the outstations were grouped together into areas with a local headquarters so that administrative support could be made efficient. The beam discovered on the 21st of June, the Knickerbein or crooked leg, was given the code name Headache, which sounded like this in the headset of an enemy pilot if he was off course to the left. Or coming in from the right. Or on course for the target. The countermeasure to the Headache was aptly named Aspirin, and transmitters were stationed at many of the outstations. They would broadcast a matching set of dash signals that would mix in with the enemy signals and sow great confusion and annoyance in the air crews. So, with Knickerbein, the Headache, seriously compromised, the Luftwaffe developed a new tactic with a more accurate target beam, the X-Gerat. The X-beam system needed expert operation, so it was only fitted to the Heinkel 111s of one elite squadron, Kampfgruppe 100, KGR 100 for short. They carried out the new Pathfinder tactic. KGR 100 pilots from Vannes in Brittany would fly down a Lorraine-style approach beam on a new 70 megacycles frequency, showing up on a visual indicator in the cockpit. Their mission was to correctly identify the target and set it ablaze with incendiaries, allowing the main bomber force to home in on the target visually. 3 other beams were involved, coming out of Calais. The outer beam crossed the Heinkel's track as a warning 50 kilometers out from the target. This allowed an accurate starting point to measure speed. When the second cross beam at 15 kilometers was picked up, a special type of clock was started by the navigator. And as the pilot held a very steady course and speed, the third cross beam at 5 kilometers out was reached. The navigator would stop one hand of the clock, allowing the other hand to continue to advance until it engaged with the stopped hand, triggering the bomb release automatically. Very clever and very accurate. This was the tactic used by KGR 100 on the Coventry raid of 14th of November 1940. RAF 80 Wing called the X-beam system Ruffians. That night over Coventry, the ruffians really had been let loose. That all changed after KGR 100 Heinkel, out of fuel, made a forced landing on this beach at West Bay, Bridport, on the 6th of November 1940. The Air Investigation Branch from Farnborough was able to eventually salvage the X-Gerat equipment, albeit coated in seawater. The Heinkel had actually suffered at the hands of 80 Wing countermeasures from the Templecombe outstation, which had been masquerading as the German St Malo homing beacon. In due course, the salvaged X-beam equipment yielded the solution. The system worked with a frequency modulated at 2000 megacycles per second and had a special filter to keep out any other frequencies. Our bromide jammers had been set to 1500 megacycles per second. Improved bromide jammers were rolled out, which began to dent KGR 100's effectiveness. 3 of the 4-man crew of the Heinkel scrambled ashore into captivity. The body of the navigator Feldwebel Otto Paul was washed up on the beach later in the day. Yet another Plendl-designed beam system was put into use by the Luftwaffe. The ground watcher stations could hear it, but it took a search ensign equipped with an oscilloscope to unravel its nature. Its pulse rate was at 180 per minute, too fast for the human ear. Direction was given from an outgoing beam from Poix in France, and ranging was achieved by a responder in the aircraft returning the signal to a live ground controller. This operator could use his range measurement to send a Morse signal to the bomber at the precise moment the bomb load should be dropped. This was Plendl's Waigarat threat, which RAF 80 Wing called Benito after the rebellious Mussolini. A very effective countermeasure transmitter was developed. They codenamed it Benjamin. So 3 different beam systems had been unleashed by the resourceful Germans. Knickerbein, the crooked leg, fitted to all Luftwaffe bombers. The headache, compromised by our aspirin transmitters. Excarat, with the 3 crossbeams, fitted only in Heinkel's of KGR 100, the Pathfinder Squadron. The bunch of ruffians, tamed by our bromide transmitters. And Waigarat, the 2-way system under a live ground controller. Benito, defeated by our Benjamin sets. 80 Wing invented another countermeasure, Meekening, masking the beacons. The Luftwaffe pilots came to rely upon homing radio beacons to find their way back to bases in France. 80 Wing copied their beacons, re-radiating the German signals from masts in England, often to startling effect. This is the flight path of a trainee crew in a Dornier 217, using the German paintball beacon to search for shipping in the Atlantic. A strong wind and the 80 Wing Templecombe and Newbury Meekons lured the aircraft on a merry journey that finished up with a landing at Lydd in Kent. Out of fuel, it was the pilot's hope that it was a French runway. The local Home Guard stepped in to make a famous arrest. In part 1, we've set out to explain the nature of the ingenious beam systems laid over the country by the Luftwaffe in 1940 and 1941, and the clever but secret Royal Air Force countermeasures dreamed up by the 80 Wing boffins. In part 2, on the next disc, we tell a story of how a group of local history enthusiasts uncovered 80 Wing's wartime presence in a Charnwood field, how a star witness, Ken Nichols, emerged, and the field and the story was presented to the public on 2 open days, and how an insatiable curiosity took those enthusiasts to other 80 Wing sites around the country.